Welcome to the True Connections Recovery Podcast. I'm Brigham Elton. I am a pornography and sexual addiction counselor. We are going to help others to overcome pornography use, sexual abuse, and sexual fear by chasing healthy sexuality and being aware of the messages that are being sent to us sexually all around us. At times, these topics are hard to talk about, but our goal is to promote conversation and to help individuals feel understood and to help you feel like you're not alone. I'm so grateful you've chosen to be with us today. Talking about sexual relationships. The first section is called Your Child's Intimate Relationship, and it talks a lot about how adolescent relationships differ from adult relationships. There's a couple parts here that I want to hit. The one thing, it says your child may be hesitant or shy to speak at first, but the more you seem genuinely interested in their relationship as opposed to anxious or judgmental, the more he will feel safe sharing these personal details. I think sometimes it's helpful for me to detach, right? Detach that how this is going to affect me emotionally and just be in a state of learning. And if I can spend that time in a state of learning about their life, I think that genuine interest shines through and allows conversations to open. That child is already being self-critical and hearing your judgment and your values without you saying anything. And this is a great chance for you to not say anything, because they're hearing it either way, right? If my child tells me about a relationship that they know I wouldn't like, in their brain they're going, oh, mom would say this or dad would say this. You don't have to actually say it. And if you just are interested in their life, they will really open up, and they already will be consciously going through how their behavior matches your values that they perceive. The next part says this: the combination of poor communication and budding hormones means that teenage relationships tend to be short-lived but quite intense. I want to read that one more time. The combination of poor communication and budding hormones means that teen relationships tend to be short-lived but quite intense, which is why your teenager might become very upset after ending a relationship that lasted only a few months. This is a huge difference between adolescent relationships and adult relationships, is this ability to communicate feeling, the ability to communicate disagreements, and those things then eventually either come up to blow up or somebody just hides all the time from them. But that pattern keeps these relationships from usually being deep, mature relationships. Instead, they are intense and short, and yet those breakups become quite difficult. But this is the process of maturity. It says here at the end, all of this will help your child develop greater maturity and healthier self-esteem, which means fewer fights and breakups, more healthy, serious, developed, and adult-like relationships. This is the process, and allow it to be a process. As a parent, sometimes I think we get nervous, but this is part of the process of learning how to be in a relationship and to be in a partnership, is some of that intense, hard, blown out of proportion things. And as an adult and as a parent, it's helpful to be in it with them and not going oh my gosh, you are making this molehill into a mountain. The one other little line that I'd like to talk about is enough parental disapproval of a relationship can serve to cement the relationship. And just be careful about that, right? It can really unify the us if it's us versus the parents. And instead of actually being this discouragement to the relationship, this is a chance for your child to learn they are practicing adulthood, and allowing them the space to fail on their own is really helpful. Now understand they get to a point where safety may be an issue and maybe a parent needs to step in, but your disapproval does not need to be spoken, especially not more than once. A child hears that, and if you keep speaking out against it, then it gives this relationship a thrill and this excitement that may be fabricated because it's against a parent's beliefs or value system. Sex and emotions. I think as it hits this part about sex and the way that emotion is connected to sex, I think that's such an important thing to be stressing in a partnership. And as kids enter those partnerships, you're talking about it consistently, I think it can be shared by sharing about the way that sex affects you emotionally, the way it affects your relationship, the way it affects the way you view yourself. And like that personal sharing is going to give depth and emotion, because a child will feel that emotion that you're communicating, right? Like as I talk about the way that sex affects me and makes me feel like more confident and like safe in my relationship, like you can hear the emotion behind that. And so that self-expression is really going to help a child connect emotion to sex. If you will connect emotion to sex and talk about what it means to you, right? I think sometimes we just say like, oh yeah, sex is beautiful, or it's sacred, or it's important, or whatever. But you're talking about a thing instead of about a human and how it affects you. I really like how it talks about here that like explaining that like the first sexual experience can really be awkward. And you want to be with someone that you feel like safe and trust, that like you can trust with your body and your soul. And I think as it becomes this like, you know, a moment that can be a little shaky sometimes, but like you want to be with someone that will make you feel safe and accepted, really does raise the expectation of a first sexual experience to something that's like emotionally important, not just like, did I perform the correct way? It also talks about like helping and giving ideas to your child about ways to create intimacy that's not physical intimacy, right? Like, and again, that's something you can talk about, like that you and your partner do. Like, yeah, like we go on dates, or we talk about like our dreams, or we do these, like we go dancing or whatever, but like share other ways that you connect to your partner. I think especially in like young adolescent relationships that like physical intimacy becomes out of balance, and it becomes something that kids are constantly doing in order to intimately connect to your partner, instead of connecting in multiple ways and not just being physically intimate. The last part is here about like hormones and the ways that men and women experience orgasm differently. And I wanted to read this just because I think it gives a lot of insight into the sexual experience. When men and women reach orgasm, their brains are flooded with oxytocin, otherwise known as the cuddle hormone. Oxytocin creates feel-good emotions and feelings of bonding. So that happens to both men and women. Research suggests that male levels of testosterone counteract this release of oxytocin, minimizing its effects. In other words, while women are experiencing this like bonding high, men don't feel it as strongly because the testosterone battles with that. Of course, everyone's balances are a little bit different, but like knowing this principle, I think, can help us to understand that like those connections really aren't the same. And I think teaching that to our children can help them as well, to help them understand that like, hey, not everyone's sexual experience is the same, and understand that, and understand like how your brain is built to bond, but especially that is true from the female perspective. This next section is entitled Teaching About Sexual Risk, and it starts by talking about STDs, and then it goes into like pregnancy itself. And there's a bunch of different beliefs about pregnancy and STDs and when they can be caused and all that kind of stuff. But like the one thing that I want to stress here is that there is no such thing as safe sex. Like all sex has risk, and a lot of times it's really worth that risk. Like that bonding is so powerful. But because of that bond, there is risk with it. There's emotional risk. There's physical risk. Like even me and my like married monogamous sexual life, like there's still risk. There's emotional risk. There's this like physical risk of whether it's pregnancy or whatever. But the question is like, what type of sex is safe enough for you? And I think for children, we want to be teaching them like how to mitigate risk, right? Like we talked about a lot about relationships and how to mitigate emotional risk. And to help you choose safe relationships, we're going to be talking about in the next section about contraception and like how to mitigate pregnancy risk. And there's talk about here about STDs and ways to mitigate STD risk. And one of the greatest ways to mitigate STD risk is to have accurate learning, right? And one thing I think is really important is that STDs aren't just transferred via vaginally or anally penetrative sex. They're also passed via manual sex. They're also passed via oral sex, right? Like even like herpes can be passed just through kissing, and like understanding that it has risk. Like physical intimacy, even if it's not penetrative sex, has sexual risk. And the consequences of that really matter. Like a big reason for people being infertile is STDs. And it's one of the primary causes of that in the world currently. And so I think, again, knowledge is one of the best ways that sexual risk can be mitigated. In the next section here, it talks about teaching about sexual protection. And there really is two schools of thought, whether they teach about abstinence or they teach about sexual protection. But in my opinion, like, it's important to teach both, because even individuals who are like married, like if they're lacking sexual protection knowledge and contraception knowledge, I think that really does affect their partnership, right? And I think knowing the risks of each contraception really does matter. And we'll go over some of those here. It has this chart here on page 149 that talks about different contraceptions, and I think there are really three primary different types of contraception. There are spermicides, like it talks about down here in like the diaphragm. Actually, I don't know how to say that word, but it's a specific type of spermicide, which is just a rubber disc that releases this chemical that is meant to kill sperm. Now, of course, you put that inside of your body. You like put a pretty strong chemical inside of your body, and so sometimes people like have really moved away from these spermicides. These were more common in like the 90s and the 80s, but now most people don't really use those. There are like hormonal birth controls, right? And these hormonal birth controls do a consistent thing where they kind of raise the base level of hormone to kind of take away the rises of the other hormones, and then they then stress something, whether it's pretending like you're pregnant or forcing a flush or whatever. The negative side of these hormonal birth controls is they really do affect a woman all the time. And I think these have become really common because women see reproductive doctors and men really don't. And so a lot of times, like, the responsibility of birth control is kind of placed on women, which I think is really actually inappropriate. And it's a lot, in my opinion, easier for the body to use a barrier contraception, especially if a male uses a condom. Like, that affects you only during like sexual intimacy, and it is 98% effective when hormonal birth controls are like 99. And so it's very similar, especially if it's used correctly, right? I think that's a big part, is like, how do you use them? I think this effectiveness, I want to read this part. Used correctly, a condom is 98% effective in preventing pregnancy. Putting the condom on midway through intercourse will reduce its level of protection. The big reason for that is because pre-ejaculate can also have sperm in them. As will using oil-based lubricants, which can damage latex. Condoms offer the best protection against STDs aside from abstinence. And also, it's not as effective to use 2 condoms as it is to use 1. I think sometimes that is important to understand. I think condoms are really the best way for people to go. And it's important that you find your right size and you learn how to like use a condom and like roll it on and test it with your fingers before you roll it on, and squeeze the air out of the little top tip so that your ejaculate has a place to go. But if you use a condom correctly, like, it is a phenomenal way to handle contraception. And I think it's something that, like, for me, like, I kind of want to speak about and push a little bit more, and not just leave that burden onto females to handle contraception. When, as a parent, you teach about contraception, I think it's important that you talk about, like, how to obtain it, whether that's something that you're going to provide or, like, telling about where that you could purchase one of these things. And also that you still stress your, like, value system. Like, you can be very clear about your desire for your child to be abstinent and to wait sexually, but still teaching accurate sexual contraception information, so that your child knows, like, this is how to handle, if I choose to be sexual, this is how I can manage that risk. If you look on page 153, it does teach pretty accurately how to use condoms. And I understand that, like, it talks about in number 2 that, like, condoms sometimes ruin the mood, but you know what? Sex isn't this magical roller coaster that we pretend it is in the movies. Like, it is actually like connecting to someone else, you know, and like that's the focus, and it doesn't have to ruin that connection, right? I think this diagram is really helpful on page like 153 to talk about like how to put on a condom. And I think that that's something that's easier taught with pictures than to like explain, right? Like, as I'm here explaining it just with audio, like I think that's pretty hard. But if you can show pictures even to your kids, like I think this is a great way to show that. As we talk about making sexual decisions, we want to talk for a minute about peer pressure. I think it's really important to talk about the difference between attention versus love. And as an adult, be pointing that out, that attention doesn't equal love. And that even though, it feels like certain people are getting attention because they are more physically or sexually active, it's temporary. And it only lasts for a moment until there's the next thing, right? And I think it's important to understand that, we love humans. We give objects attention. And though we feel like it's so love, we feel like attention is love, it's not. It's not the same thing. I like this statistic at the end of page 154. It says, we found that a third of teenagers regret the first time they had sex, and that 19% of girls reported feeling pressured into their first sexual experience. And then it talks about how boys feel like a sign of manhood is being physically or sexually active. And I think as a parent, we can be the opposite side of that and be communicating the opposite side. It also talks about this, examining sexual motivations. So often, kids aren't even really thinking about why and, what's the reason behind what I'm doing. And I think that isn't something that's going to happen in the moment. That's something that we need to be asking our child to do in a moment of calmness and reflection, not in a sexual moment, right? In that sexual moment, the decision is being made in a split second. I think it's important that decision is made previous. The next section here is about oral and anal sex, and there's some statistics that I would just like to read. This is from the National Center of Health Statistics. Half of all American teens aged 15 to 19 have engaged in oral sex. The number increases the older teens are, and about 70% of teens aged 18 to 19 have done so. I think it's important to understand the prominence of oral sex. It's something that is happening quite often. And even anal sex has increased in percentage, right? It's 4.6% of 15-year-old boys have had anal sex with a female. 34% of ages 22 to 24. Wow. 34% of ages 22 to 34. And by age 24, 1 in 3 women have tried anal sex. And so just understanding that that's a prominent part of the sex world that our teenagers are growing up in. And this is, again, this book is from 2008. And so those statistics have even increased since then, right? It also talks about that 70% of teenagers do not use protection during oral sex, and that these teens are having multiple sex partners. Almost a quarter of teens responded they had been with 3 or 4 oral sexual partners in the next year. This is a prominent thing, and kids aren't really protecting it, though 80% of STDs or STIs can be passed orally. The big thing I want to hear here with oral sex is these, on page 157, some of these things you might say to your daughter or your son. I just want to read both of these. First off, an instance that you might say to your daughter. I heard on the news the other day that oral sex is becoming more common among junior high and high school students. Awesome entrance point, right? Because you're not interesting about some human or about them. You're just hey, I heard about this, right? The sad part is that oral sex is just as intimate as intercourse, but kids seem to treat it as casually as they do kissing. It especially makes me sad to think about young girls performing oral sex on boys in order to be accepted. I hope that you know that you don't have to perform oral sex in order to make boys like you, and that your body is much too valuable to be treated with such disrespect. And then it goes through a couple questions to give that child a chance to speak, which most of the time they probably won't. But I think that talking about the attention and women feeling this pressure that they are supposed to do that for men, I think is an awesome thing to combat. The second thing is for the teenage son. I hear a lot about young girls giving boys oral sex these days, but I don't hear a lot about boys doing the same. I know you are respectful of women and you wouldn't ever use them for a sexual purpose, but do you have friends that think about that? Do they think that oral sex involves a give and take, or they just expect girls to do it? Just bringing that up and challenging that mindset, I think is really powerful. We are seeing some media which is being more promotive of boys orally stimulating women, but it usually was this something that men get from women. And it really was this task that women did, and really it kind of had this mindset of it was kind of degrading, right? And I think to just challenge that and be look, do you just expect girls to do that? or does that go both ways, I think really matters. Even in pornography, it's like way more common for a woman to orally stimulate a man than it is for a man to orally stimulate someone else. And then it says, like, we want to view pleasure as something that is shared. And I think speaking about that to our kids is helpful, that, like, this is a shared pleasure. It's not just for men. Especially in our Puritan culture, that for men mindset can really be taught. And we want to, again, counteract that with truths. As they continue this talk about encouraging healthy sexual decisions, the final thing that it talks about is setting personal sexual goals. It talks about here, an ABC News poll found that 70% of teens admitted their first time with sex was unplanned. And that lack of forethought often means a lack of protection. I think that, again, like, we want to be discussing with our child their sexual values over and over and over again, and just getting a feel for where they're at. Like, what age do they want to be? Like, what do they want? Type of relationship do they want to be in? Like, especially when they're not in a relationship, is a great time to be talking about sex, because then they're talking about sex in general, and they aren't mentally just thinking about sex with Brian or Amy or whatever. And so those moments, as a parent, we want to be creating those and to be talking about, like, okay, like, what type of relationship, like, what are your sexual, like, goals, like, when do you think it's healthy for someone, like, what do you think about your friends doing it? I think that stuff really, really matters. And then it talks a little bit about sexual history, that, like, you can talk about your own decisions and whether or not you agree with them or disagree with them, or what pressures you felt, and, like, share your values. And when you share your own values, it's helpful to share a little bit of history. And that may even get your child to not only share their values, but also maybe a little bit of their history that you may or may not know about. Now, the one thing that I want to hit that's not really in this chapter, but it's something that I really do believe deeply, is how important it is to separate between desire and choice, right? Yeah, you may have the desire to be sexual with your partner, but your choice is more important than that. I also see where, like, boys will do this, like, hey, like, her body was responding. It was obvious that she wanted it. And this belief that because someone wanted it, that they are automatically choosing it. Those two things are not the same. They are separate. Just because someone's body, or they may even want to have sex with you, doesn't mean that they're choosing to be sexual with you. Just because I may want to have sex doesn't mean that I have to choose to have sex. Choice is more powerful than desire. And this even goes the opposite way. Like, there are times in my relationship with my wife when my wife does not want to be sexual with me, but she chooses to try anyway. And I think that is so, so important. It's the same for me in emotional intimacy. Like, I come home from work and sometimes I do not want to be emotionally available and talk about our days and, like, emotionally open up. I just want to be done. But even though I want that, I choose to emotionally open up anyway. Choice is more important than desire. And that goes positively and negatively. And it's important that we distinguish between those two things. Even in our home, like, sometimes my wife will be like, hey, do you want to do the dishes? And I'm like, absolutely, I do not want to do the dishes, but I will. And I think my child seeing that there's a difference between choice and desire matter, and that is especially true with sex. Just because someone has sexual desire does not mean that they have to do it. And just because someone isn't in the mood for sex doesn't mean they can't choose to try. And sometimes that choice, like when my wife will sometimes choose to be sexual with me, even though it wasn't naturally in her desire, means actually a lot to me. Just as when my wife knows that I come home from having emotional discussions all day, and I will choose to emotionally engage with her though I may not want to, that can have more meaning. Desire is not more important than choice. Thank you so much for being here with us today. Please share. This really helps us to succeed as a community as you share information like this. And if you ever feel like you could use some individual help, please set up a free consultation. You can visit us at our website at trueconnectionsrecovery.com and set up a free consultation there. Thank you.